All right, so today is the last sermon in the Gospel of John. We've been in John for several months. And then after this, we conclude this sermon series. As I mentioned, maybe you forgot, we're going to go into 1 John, the letter of 1 John. Why? Because 1 John directly relates to the Gospel of John, specifically chapters 13 through 17 in the Gospel of John. 1 John kind of seems to be a commentary on John chapters 13 through 17, so that's why we're going to go to 1 John. Maybe it'll give us more insight to the things that John records in his gospel. But to begin today, I want you to think about one question. How do I love? How do I love? Now, obviously, we've talked about love quite a bit because the Gospel of John contains a lot of teachings. It contains a lot of examples of love. Love is obviously one of the most taught, one of the most preached, if not the most taught and the most preached theme in the whole history of the church. As we know, however, love is not just a theme. In Scripture, of course, love is both seen as an action. An action, at times, it's described as a feeling, described as an affection, and sometimes love is personified in Scripture. So there's a lot that is taught about. There's a lot said concerning love. But just for today, I want us to consider the question, how do I love? Because the thing is, there's not one exclusive way to love. Our love is not just seen in giving a meal to someone in need, though that is loving. Love is not just seen in praying for someone, though that is loving. And love is not just something that your minister gives. Love is not exclusive to one profession. How do you love? To end our series of the Gospel of John, we are looking at John 21, verses 15 through the end, verse 25. And in this text, this is, of course, one of the most pretty well-known texts, of course, where Jesus, he asked Peter 3 times if he loves him. Peter, of course, says he does, and then Jesus essentially tells Peter, all right, you love me, you'll love my sheep. You love me, you'll love my sheep. And in Peter's case, loving meant shepherding. Loving meant feeding the sheep. And so as we go through verses 15 through 25 to end this series, as we read this text, I want you to consider the question, how do I love? Because how you love is going to look a little different than how Peter loved. It's going to look a little different how each one of us love. Peter himself has to struggle with this in the text. He has to struggle with the fact that his path of following Jesus and loving the sheep looks different than his fellow apostle. So we ask the question, how do I love? Because it's going to look different. John chapter 21. John chapter 21, verses 15 through 25. As I've been doing, we're just going to read this text. We're going to break it apart. Verses 15 through 25. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. I'm going to pause real quick. It's not on the slides if you've got that by now. I'm just reading this, so just listen to me as I read this. Verse 17, he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back against him during the supper, and said, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said, Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die, yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he shall remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now, there are also many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written. I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Now, one quick note before we walk through the text. You may have heard preachers take this text, and they draw out the two different words that are used for love. You didn't know that? When Jesus asked 3 times, the first 2 times he asked Peter, hey, do you love me? He uses the Greek word agape. And then the third time he asks it, he says, phileo. Right, so the first 2 times he uses agape, the last time he uses phileo. All 3 times Peter responds with the Greek word for love, phileo. Now, there are some preachers, there are some commentators that think there's a particular reason for this. They suggest that maybe this is Peter being honest, saying that, hey, Jesus, I don't know if I agape love you yet, but I phileo love you, meaning I have this friendship, affectionate kind of love. So there are some commentators, there are some preachers who think there's some point there. Other commentators suggest that this is just stylistic. John uses close synonyms interchangeably, and I think he does. Example of this is in verse 17. Verse 17, again, that says, he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Pause. 2 words for know. 2 different Greek words for know, yet John uses them interchangeably. All this being said, there are some people who try to draw something from the 2 different words for love. I'm not inclined to think that there's a point in that. I'm inclined to think that's just stylistic. John is using those 2 words interchangeably. All that being said, for those who like the little details, the little language details, that's for you. If that's not for you, we're going to continue. Verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. Who are the these? Right, so you remember we had the setting where they're out fishing, several of the apostles, and then Jesus, of course, you have this scene where he tells them to cast their net, try to get another haul, and they fall in 153 fish, and then they come to shore, and Jesus already has breakfast made. Right, that was the scene before this text. So who are the these? Do you love me more than these fish? Or do you love me more than these other disciples love me? Do you love me more than you love these disciples? Who are these? Now, I think it's unlikely that Jesus is referring to the fish. I think it might make more sense that Jesus is saying to Peter, do you love me more than these love me? Now, why do I think that makes sense? Because of Peter's reputation. An example of this, Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14, verses 26 through 31. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, you will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Verses 29 and 31. Peter said to him, even though they all fall away, I will not. And Jesus said to him, truly, I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said the same. This is why I think Jesus means, do you love me more than these love me? Peter has a reputation of saying, hey, look at me, Jesus. I love you more than these. I'm not leaving you, Jesus. They might leave you, but I'm not leaving you. Now, regardless of what Jesus meant by the question, and in John 21, you get the sense that Jesus is essentially telling Peter, if you say you love me, you will love my sheep. You will love my sheep. John 21, verse 15, when he says, feed my lambs, that's in the imperative. Imperative. See, if Peter loves Jesus, it's not a possibility that he's going to love the sheep. It's not a possibility. You love Jesus, you love his sheep. So before we even get to the question, how do I love? Church, if we say we love Jesus, we will love his sheep. If you say you love Jesus but do not love his sheep, you are a liar. If I say I love Jesus but I do not love you all, I'm a liar. We cannot love Jesus without loving his sheep. In Peter's case, loving the sheep looked like a pastoral role as an apostle leading and guiding the early church. So when we ask the question, how do I love? It's going to look different than Peter. He had a specific role as an apostle, loving the church in the way he did. Our role, our place, where God has placed us is going to look different. Verse 16, we continue, chapter 21. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. So 2 things in this text Jesus says in the imperative. First time he says, feed my sheep, imperative. Second time he says, tend or shepherd my sheep, also in the imperative. So just a quick application for shepherds, for pastors. Pastors do 2 things, provide and guide. Pastors do 2 things. They provide and guide, and of course we're talking in a spiritual sense, right? Guiding the sheep to Jesus, providing the teaching, providing the words of Jesus to nourish the sheep. John chapter 6, what did Jesus say? He says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Shepherds lead, they guide sheep to Jesus, who is our eternal satisfaction. That's the role, that's the purpose of a shepherd. And I want you to ask yourself, how do I love? Because, again, not everybody fills that role. How do I love the sheep? Keep thinking about that as we continue. Verse 17, he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Of course, we all know this is recalling the 3 times that Peter denied Jesus. Right? At that time, Peter did anything but love Jesus. Right? In fact, Peter wasn't even willing to identify with Jesus. It's not that he wasn't even willing to love. He wasn't even willing to identify with Jesus. Yet, that was not the end of his story. And I think this is a pretty universal experience among believers. Coming to belief, then failing, but then being restored. When Peter denied Jesus, Jesus didn't love him any less. He welcomes Peter back. He tells Peter, now you love me, good. He welcomes Peter back to the purpose of loving him, which means loving his sheep. You see, we may fail. We may fail, but Jesus welcomes us back to the purpose of loving him, which means loving his sheep. So how do I love? For Peter, it meant being an apostle. For Peter, it meant guiding. For Peter, it meant nurturing the early church. How do I love? Are you a doctor? Are you a nurse? In taking care of your patients, or sometimes do the patients stress your patience? And when that happens, what do? Do you lash out or do you pray for them? Are you a teacher? And now I'm going to talk about these vocations. Obviously, I'm not in any of those vocations. I teach, but I'm not a teacher in a primary school or anything like that. But do you teach? Again, I'm talking about this. I'm not a teacher. But what are ways that you love the sheep? When it comes to maybe a parent-teacher conference, maybe you have a student that has some behavioral issues, you know there are problems at home. How do you respond to those parents when you sit down with them, knowing that they need to love their children more? Or knowing that they need to love their children in ways that they don't currently do? How do you love that person? Are you a coach? How do you love your athletes? How do you love your athletes? Do you draw a comparison between faith and the perseverance it requires compared to a sports and the perseverance it requires, the practice it requires, yet highlighting a difference between the victory of faith and the victory of a sport? Or you may work for a victory in a sport and obtain some sort of win, get that W. You may do that. You may get that by your work. But at the end of the day, the victory of faith, not won by us. Not won by us. Do we highlight that as you teach your athletes? Are you a counselor? Are you trying to help and heal people who struggle with mental illness? Again, I know that stresses patience. Are you praying for these people? Are you a blue-collar worker? Are you working with people? Is this just something where you go to your job, you clock in, clock out, it's just about making money? Are you an administrator? Are you working to love the people who work under you? Are you trying to make their jobs better? Or are you just concerned about them working for you, making your job better, making yourself comfortable? Right? How do I love you? See, no matter the profession, and again, I'm talking about these professions as somebody who's not in those professions, but no matter your profession, you'll know how you can love the sheep. And I know sheep are people who come to belief in Jesus, and I'm talking generally about loving people because guess what? We're not really the ones in charge of determining who's in or out. We don't always know who's going to be a sheep. We don't always know who's going to come to faith. And so, the safe bet is, as Jesus himself teaches, to just love everybody, your enemies. Love everybody. In your profession, you can love. How do I love? Verses 18 and 19, chapter 21. Truly, truly, I say to you, he's saying to Peter, truly, truly, I say to you, Peter, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God, and after saying this, he said to him, follow me. Now, just to do some interpreting for you, anytime you see the phrase to stretch out one's hands, that was a pretty clear way that they were describing crucifixion. So Jesus is telling Peter, hey, you're going to die. Your path leads to martyrdom. His path of following Jesus, his path of loving Jesus and his sheep leads to death. And as is said at the end of verse 18 here, another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Here's the thing. I know that most people in here, more than likely none of us in here are going to suffer the same result as Peter. At least right now it seems that way. Doesn't seem like any of us are going to be martyrs. But where is a place or where is your love taking you that you don't want to go? Because the reality is, if you love Jesus, you love his sheep, and your love for the sheep will take you where you do not want to go. Again, maybe it's that parent-teacher conference. Dealing with difficult parents. Maybe it's that house you go, you take food on the route for a soup kitchen, you go and you come into the house, it's not a well-kept house. Again, just being honest here, it kind of smells. And there's part of you that doesn't want to take the time to talk to them because of the location, how it looks. Where is your love taking you that you don't want to go? Love takes you where you don't want to go. Love's not always easy. And in fact, look at this. What does Jesus say to Peter? Or at least the note in verse 19, it says, this he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. Do you think Peter actually really wanted to die by martyrdom? Like desired it? Meaning he said, that sounds really great, Jesus. That's really appealing to me. Love takes you where you don't want to go. And that place, as verse 19 says, glorifies God. Where Peter went, where he didn't want to go, it glorified God. Where does our love take us? How do I love, even if it means going somewhere where I don't want to go? The end of verse 19, again, that says, after saying this, he said to him, follow me. So in this text, it's kind of subtle, but not only is Jesus calling back to Peter's denial, but Jesus is also calling back to his foretelling of Peter's denial. John chapter 13. John chapter 13, verses 36 through 38. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. So in John chapter 21, verse 19, when Jesus says, "Follow me," now he means you're following me to die on a cross. You couldn't before, but now you are. Verses 20 and 21, back in John 21, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following him, the one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and said, "Lord, who is it that's going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" So when we ask the question, how do I love? It's not going to look the same as others. For Peter, it meant following Jesus, it meant loving Jesus, it meant loving his sheep to the point of dying. And Peter looks back at John and says, "Well, what about him? You say that I'm going to die as a martyr. It would be nice not to do that alone. Didn't you have two others with you, Jesus? Why can't I have somebody with me?" Right? He looks back at John and says, "What about him? What about him?" Jesus responds to Peter, verses 22 and 23. Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? When we ask the question, how do I love? Don't compare yourself to other people. Maybe it's out of jealousy, maybe it's out of self-righteousness, maybe it's out of self-consciousness, but for whatever reason, don't compare yourself, as Peter kind of feels like he needs to. Like, what about John? Doesn't he need to do the same thing as I'm doing? See, how we love will look a little bit different one from another. For Peter, it meant dying on a cross. For you, it's going to look different. For Peter, it meant being an apostle. It meant shepherding the early church. For you, that's going to look different. How do I love? But here's the thing. Even though the details may be different, right, the details of how we love may be different, but the fact is, as a Christian, if you love Jesus, in whatever role, in whatever form or fashion, you will love his sheep. Nobody can say, "I love Jesus," and not love his sheep. At least they could. They would be lying. If you love Jesus, if you truly love Jesus, you will love his sheep. John closes his gospel in this way, verses 24 and 25. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now, there are many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written. I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. We have a glimpse, a piece of Jesus' life, a piece of Jesus' ministry. This does not contain, if you don't know this already, this does not contain all that was said or all that was done by Jesus. Yet it's more than enough for us to believe. As John 20, verse 31 says, "But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name, that we may believe and have life in his name as sheep." The sheep have life in Jesus' name, and not just sheep who consume. Right? Jesus did not bring you into his pasture just to consume grass. No. Jesus has gathered a herd of sheep that, yes, they consume, they receive their sustenance, they receive their nourishment, they receive their eternal satisfaction from him, but they're not just sheep who consume, they're sheep who love. Sheep who love as they have been loved. Sheep who may not do the exact same things, but sheep who love each other. So believe, receive, love, as we stand and sing.